So, welcome to 3 COP Outcomes We Can't Live Without. This event has been put on by Zero Hour, which is the campaign calling for urgent integrated action on the climate and nature crises. We are calling on the government to push for the following 3 COP outcomes we can't live without. 1, to create a joint emergency strategy for climate and nature. 2, to commit to the carbon budget for 1.5. And 3, to go nature positive by 2030. The purpose of this event today is to give you a chance to hear from some world-leading experts to talk about the best science and how this science can inform policy making. So, without further ado, I'll pass on to Sir David King, who will be chairing today. I'll just introduce him, although he needs no introduction, of course. But Sir David is Emeritus Professor of Chemistry at the University of Cambridge and was founding director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the Environment at Oxford University between 2008 to 12. He served as the UK government's chief scientific advisor between 2000 and 2007, and as the Foreign Secretary's special representative for climate change between 2013 to 17. So David is also founder and chair of both the Centre for Climate Repair at the University of Cambridge and the Independent Climate Crisis Advisory Group. We're really grateful to Sir David and of course to all our speakers today for their ongoing support of Zero Hour, the CEE bill and our COP outcomes. So thank you. Over to you, Sir David.
Amy, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted. I think the CEE bill is a very, very important way to take us towards a safer future. We have a belief that we are apart from nature and not a part of nature. And that is a belief that has led us into developing an economic system that has been, I would have to say, extremely successful if measured in terms of improved human well-being over the past few hundred years. But what, of course, we've missed is the fact that we are a part of nature and we are in the process of destroying the very ecosystems that we, as a part of nature, critically depend on. But we are also now made very aware of the dramatic changes to global weather systems caused by our use of fossil fuels, our destruction of natural forests, and the destruction of this particular ecosystem is now threatening the future of humanity in anything like the form that we know it now. Because of what is happening largely in the Arctic Circle region, where Arctic ice has been melting more and more rapidly, covering the Arctic Ocean, until the Arctic Ocean during the polar summer is now exposed to sunlight over that 3-month period, and the Arctic North Pole region is now a warmer part of the Northern Hemisphere than most people anticipate and realize. One of the members of the Climate Crisis Advisory Group is a representative of the Sami people who live up in the north of Scandinavia. He lives in Finland. And I spoke to him in May, June this year, and he said the local temperature was about minus 30 degrees centigrade. Then I spoke to him again in late July, and he said, you won't believe it, the temperature today is plus 32. A 62 degrees centigrade temperature rise over a few months. And we're looking at a situation, if I can just take one area of the world, that in 30 years' time in Southeast Asia, the country of Vietnam will be flooded with seawater, 90% of the landmass, seawater flooded at least once a year, just in 30 years' time, by mid-century. When I describe this as a climate crisis, what I'm saying is this irreversible loss of ice on land has led to a situation where over the coming hundreds of years, we are going to see eventually a sea level rise of about 20 meters. And when all of that has melted, global sea levels will have risen by 23 feet. But in addition, ice is melting from other bits of land around the world. including, for example, the Himalayas. And all of that ends up in the global ocean. But what is required is extremely rapid action to manage this problem. And I'm now proposing a solution to this, which is a holistic solution set out by the Climate Crisis Advisory Group, which is we need to reduce our emissions. The first R, reduce our emissions deeply and rapidly. We've got to stop using fossil fuels. We've got to reforest our land masses that have lost their forests. But we also have to, the second R, remove the excess greenhouse gases we've already put in the atmosphere so we can return to where the ice is covering the Arctic Ocean through the period of the polar summer. And the third R is that's all going to take too long. So we also need the third R, repair. We need to see if we can manage to recover the Arctic Ocean with ice in a fairly short time scale so that as we move forward in time, the Arctic Circle region cools down more rapidly than the rest of the planet. So there's a series of enormous challenges that societies around the world need to face. After hundreds of years of destroying ecosystems, we now need to be thinking in terms of repair. Let me move you on to, I've got three wonderful speakers for you. And the first speaker is a climate scientist of great repute, Kevin Anderson, Uppsala and the University of Manchester. Kevin, can we lead straight into your presentation, please?
I'm going to start with a bit of science, and hopefully this is quite straightforward. The climate does not respond to good intentions, to Machiavellian policies, eloquent arguments, legal niceties, or accountancy scams. All of these are trumped by the brutal beauty of the physics. It's the total quantity of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that we put in the atmosphere that ultimately relate to temperature and thereby to impacts. So we have to remember it's the total amount of CO2. That's what really matters. Now, the UK, I think, and I still hold this view, the UK was world leading in 2008 in terms of its legislation. The Climate Change Act in 2008 was actually, I think it's better than Sweden's recent climate legislation in 2019. So it's still, relative to other parts of the world, it's an excellent piece of legislation. But is it up to the job in 2021? In 2009, we had the really interesting paper that came out, which actually is one of the papers I think that would be a founding piece of academic work underpinning the CE bill. It's the Planetary Boundaries Assessment, and obviously a lot of continued work since 2009. 2014, we had the first IPCC report that actually embedded within it what the carbon budgets were for different temperatures at different probabilities. Of course, in 2015, the end of 2015, we had the Paris Agreement, which is probably the most influential of all of the major agreements that we've had in the recent years. And within that, it made clear that we need to reduce our emissions to hold to well below 2 and ideally aim for 1.5, but also to recognize these are hugely serious levels of impacts associated with these that will be disproportionately felt around the world and within human systems and indeed ecosystems. And then building on the 1.5 element of the Paris Agreement, the scientific community was asked to look at that, and it published its 1.5 report in 2018, and it demonstrated the huge impacts at 1.5 and how come though they are bad, they are not as bad as those at 2. So these small temperature differences make a huge difference in terms of the impacts that we're going to face. And that, I think, was really a prelude to a whole suite of statements across the UK on climate emergencies. Every devolved administration and the UK government announcing a climate emergency, the same in the EU and other parts of the world as well. So the whole sort of language of climate emergencies. And this eventually sort of led into the G7 communique in May of this year, very importantly saying that actually, thanks to the science, we understand the impacts and we need to focus much more on not going above 1.5 degrees centigrade rather than 2 degrees centigrade. And the CE bill actually embeds that newer framing. And then since then, we've actually had the latest science, AR6, that David referred to earlier. But isn't the UK showing leadership? And I hear this when I'm in Sweden or in any other part of the world. Every country, every company, every university thinks it's showing leadership. But when you really start to unpick it, although we state in the latest reports, emissions in the UK in 2020 were 51% lower than they were in 1990. If you include international aviation and international shipping, if you include our imports and exports, so you take a full carbon footprint of UK PLC, if you like, then we've seen no real leadership. We've seen a 15% reduction since 1990. That's about 0.5% a year. And actually, most of that was after the banking crisis. Our emissions were going up until the banking crisis. So austerity, the closure of coal, a large part of which was due to sulfur regulations from the EU and partly the carbon floor price. But we've seen no real significant leadership in driving our emissions down. And that's true of Denmark, Sweden, France, and all of the climate progressive countries around the world. And I think really this becomes really obvious when you look at the UK government's own oil and gas authority. This is an executive agency of BEIS. Look at its website, look at its Twitter account, and look how really they give their opening phrases, give the lie to the appropriateness of net zero, where it states, we work with industry and government to maximize the economic recovery of UK oil and gas and support the UK government in its drive to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions. These are incompatible statements that we've completely normalized. But this normalization actually has consequences in practice. The BP Clare Ridge Phase 2 platform is going ahead. That's 250 million tons of CO2 into the atmosphere over the next 25 years. The Glengorm gas discovery, another 100 million tons of CO2. The East Yorkshire plant near Hull, 13 million tons of CO2. The UK government, through its Export Finance Agency, spending £1 billion of UK taxpayers' money to develop a huge LNG facility in Mozambique for export, I hasten to add. That's over 4 billion tons of CO2. And that lie is reinforced when you think that we have the UK's ongoing programme of airport expansion, Bristol, Leeds, Stansted, £27 billion on new roads, potentially opening a new coal mine. Hopefully that doesn't go ahead, but the planning inquiry is occurring now. And enthusiasm still for yet more oil, the new Cambo field off Shetland. So what does the IPCC tell us about Paris and G7? Well, if you look at the set of reports, what's absolutely clear, and this is obviously summarizing all these reports in one simple sentence, from a mitigation point of view, it's the total carbon budget, not long-term targets that link with temperature rise. That's what really matters. That's the CO2 and other greenhouse gases that we dump in the atmosphere. So if you take the latest figures from the IPCC and you adjust that to January 2022, then for a good chance of staying below 1.5 degrees centigrade, we can emit globally about 320 billion tons of CO2. Now, that may not mean much to most of you, but we currently emit about 40 billion tons, 36 to 37 from energy and the rest from land use. That's 8 years of current global emissions before we blow the budget for 1.5 degrees centigrade. So play that out on a little plot and assume we're going to start doing something straight away. So from 2022, and then stylistically, that's the line you have. Now imagine us doing this globally. That's zero emissions of CO2 by 2038. And of course, that's for all CO2. So it'd be even earlier that for energy. So you go back to this sort of global carbon pie that we have, 320 billion tons of CO2 if we're genuinely committed to our 1.5 degrees C rise. And we ask the question, how much did the UK get? Now, provisionally, this is based on some work I did with colleagues that was published last year, more of a focus on 2 degrees centigrade, but using the same analysis, but changing some of the numbers in this. The UK would have somewhere between 1 to 1.5 billion tons of CO2 that it can emit. And if you include aviation and shipping at the moment, from a territorial perspective, it's emitting around about 400 million tons. So about 2.5 to 4 years of current emissions for the UK. Our consumption emissions, of course, are considerably higher than that. So 2.5 to 4 years. If we are serious about our commitments, and I take it when we sign these things, we mean it honestly, then to give a flavor of what 1.5 mitigation looks like from energy, that's over 15% per annum, 15% every single year mitigation. We managed 10% in 2020 due to COVID, 6 or 7% globally, 10% roughly in the UK. That's a total reduction of about 80% by 2030 compared with 2019, and zero carbon energy by 2035, not net zero, or not zero as I prefer to call it, but real zero. That's planes, trains, cars, industry, our homes, everything. Now that sounds hugely challenging. We should have started in 1990 when the first IPCC report came out. We have chosen to squander that opportunity for 31 years. So we now face the immediate and profound system change implications of that failure to address climate change. So to conclude, the headline choice for developed nations is that if our preference is to ignore international equity, to pass a huge burden onto our children, so they have to be part of a 2.5 to 3 degrees C future, and renege on our Paris and G7 commitments. But that does allow us to dovetail with today's politics and maintain the current economic market model. Then fine, choose 5% mitigation and incremental adjustments to business as usual, and we have net zero by 2050. But then our children will have to be quite understanding as we bequeath them this sort of future. If our preference is to take international equity seriously, then we need a huge mitigation effort by this generation to cut our CO2 in line with 1.5 degrees centigrade and abide by our G7, indeed our Paris commitments. Then that requires a huge ramp up in government leadership. And I would probably argue intervention now because we've left it so late. A reshaping of mainstream economics, well, we've been doing that since 2006 with the banking crisis and now COVID, and also with equity at its core. And I would argue the COVID again, in terms of making us understand the value of key workers, has brought out the issue of equity for us to again reconsider. Now that's reductions at an aggregate level of 10 to 20% per annum and real zero by about 2035. That's pretty true for all of the wealthy parts of the world. As Einstein noted, or at least it's attributed to him, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. And thus far, we've chosen to pass on to our own children 30 years of that level of insanity. And the CE bill is a genuine, real attempt to break that and for the UK to show leadership to a new green and more prosperous future. So thanks very much for listening.
I'm now going to switch on to Professor Milner-Gulland, who is the Tasso Leventis Professor of Biodiversity at the University of Oxford. So switching over from climate science to biodiversity, Professor Milner-Gulland, over to you.
So when we think about nature, we often have a bit of a kind of bimodal point of view. Some people to think about nature in terms of big charismatic animals that live far away, or rainforests and things like that. And then, of course, there's another part of nature that's part of our everyday existence, that's part of our families and the places that we hold dear. And often those two things are seen kind of separately. So just my definition of what we think of as nature is an all-encompassing one. So we're talking both about the species, individual species, we're talking about the landscapes, we're talking about the genetic diversity that we have, particularly, for example, in our crops. We're also talking about the processes that underpin our planetary systems, so things like migration. So that is really what we mean by when we say biodiversity. So nature is biodiversity plus the landscapes and the seascapes that support it. And just as Sir David said, nature is not divorced from humanity. And it's very clear when you think about it for 30 seconds that nature's contributions to people are profound, and they're both local and they're global. So just as the climate system is global, you know, nature's contributions are also global, but they also have local dimensions. So I don't want to kind of rehearse the point, but maybe it is worth saying something about the destruction that we have wrought on nature. So over my lifetime, for example, we've lost 68% of global terrestrial wild vertebrates. We've mostly converted them into livestock. So a nice graphic here from a paper that was published in 2018 showing that 4% now of our wild mammal individuals are actual wild, and 60% are livestock, 36% are us. If you think about birds, it's 70% poultry, 30% wild. So we're massively converting a very diverse group of species into one or two species to serve our purposes. People often think also about extinction, and again, it's something that's seen as something that's rather far away, but in my lifetime, again, we've comprehensively lost 9 species of bird, but also only last week, the latest Red List assessment came out showing that 37% of shark and ray species now are threatened with extinction, which is to do with mostly overexploitation, amongst other things. And closer to home, again, thinking about the biodiversity that we see around us every day, we're losing farmland birds. This trend is continuing and is being well monitored by our citizen scientists and our NGOs. So why does biodiversity loss matter? We talk a lot about ecosystem services, about the fact that nature underpins the integrity of our food production systems. Nature underpins the integrity of our water supply, pretty fundamental. It underpins our health, our air quality, and so on. Climate change is threatening us directly, indirectly, and at an accelerating rate, and similarly, nature as well. So if we have resilient systems, if we have biodiverse systems, then we can better withstand climate change and we can better protect against pandemic risk. And that includes the kind of unsexy parts of biodiversity like soil, like those bugs that I've just put up there. So what is it that's driving biodiversity loss? Here's an interesting graphic which comes from WWF, and you can see the trends in biodiversity are different across different parts of the world, but the underlying drivers are actually remarkably similar. So about half of the biodiversity loss is coming from land use change. About a quarter is coming from overexploitation, and much of that is timber and fish and things like that, things that we use at quite large volumes. And then at the moment, climate change is not seen as a major cause of threat to populations, but it's rapidly growing. And there's other things as well, invasive species and pollution. But you can see here the land use change thing is really fundamental. So just coming down to that, here's one example that comes into the news quite a lot, which is the Cerrado in Brazil. It's a very large, very rich, very biodiverse savanna system. It's lost half of its area. That was in 2010. I'm sure there's more since then. But the last assessment, 2010, half of its area has been lost. And that is to agriculture. You can see the picture on the right of the Cerrado fields, the ecosystem there, and the very sharp divide into the fields that are now producing particularly soy. And that nice flow diagram there just demonstrates how soy is mostly going now into the livestock systems around the world, including some to us. This is a really influential and important paper that was published last year by Leclerc et al. And this kind of underpins what I've been saying. So you can see the black line, beautifully pictured with lots of lovely animals, is the current trajectory of biodiversity loss historically since 1970. It's the thing I showed you before. The grey line is where we think we're going to go over the next decades if we do nothing. So the business as usual, substantial loss of biodiversity. Interestingly, when people talk about nature, they think that protected areas or kind of conservation is going to address the issue. So if we can do, if you can make 30% of the planet into something that's protected or something like that, that'll solve it. That's the yellow line. So what you can see here is that if we do the best we can, increasing our conservation efforts as best we can, we could perhaps stabilize nature by about 2050 at a pretty low level. If we actually want to get nature back to where we were in 2010, so what David was saying about recovery, we have to do more than conservation. We have to tackle basically our production and consumption and change our supply chains. Just as Kevin was talking about, we need a system transformation. We need a system transformation for nature as well. So this is something that's now been recognised. As was mentioned before, the Convention on Biological Diversity's global goal for nature that's now being written into the global biodiversity framework that will be discussed, hopefully, finally in 2020 in China, 2022 in China, sorry, it was supposed to be being discussed 2 years ago. It's now been moved to 2022. This will be something that hopefully nations will sign up to achieve, this global goal for nature, where we actually start to turn things around by 2030. That's an ambitious goal. And the UK, of course, can contribute to that. We can contribute through capacity and finance to support implementation. We can recover our own nature, which is very depleted, not just here, but the fact we have overseas territories, which are really quite important for nature in the world. But most importantly, and I hope I'm underlining this, refraining from causing impact, reducing our impact, and restoring the impacts of our production and consumption wherever those impacts occur. And I think we do need to recognise there our historical and our ongoing responsibility for nature loss, not just at home, but also abroad. And our Prime Minister not only was one of the initiators, but an early signer of the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which joins up for the first time climate change, biodiversity, and human well-being in the same pledge with a nature focus. And I commend you to go and look at that, because it's a really strong pledge that's been made by leaders of 88 countries now, plus the EU. But these things are not joined up. Just as I said before, we have the pandas and the gorillas over there. We have our bluebell woods and our, nature here. We don't join those two things up, and we're all part of one system. And so that is the thing that I think is fundamentally missing from where we are at the moment. If you look at the Environment Bill, the very first purpose statement is great. It talks about biodiversity and climate emergency domestically and globally. If you look through the rest of the 100 and something pages, everything in that bill is about home biodiversity. It's incredibly important to save and restore our nature at home, not least for our own population's well-being. But that is not enough for that first purpose. And this is where I think the draft CEE bill does have a kind of real importance. So you can see here that in the very first thing about on the nature target, it's caused by the UK's activities wherever they may be. And it mentions this common but differentiated responsibility and historical degradation. It also focuses on prioritizing refraining from impact, not trying to make the best of things once we've damaged nature. It's never going to be as good. If we can refrain, that's so much better, cheaper, and less risky.
Thank you very much for a serious and worrying presentation. And I'm going to move quickly on now to our third speaker, who is on hand, Tim Jackson. And Tim is a professor at the University of Surrey, ecological economist, and director of the Centre for Understanding of Sustainable Prosperity at the University of Surrey. And straight over to you, Tim.
The first most obvious point is that we are not in a normal situation. We are in a situation of distress, and that distress is evident through the climate damages that we're already seeing. It's evident through the damage to nature. It's evident to some extent through our ability to respond effectively to those situations. It's evident in our political system. It's evident in our ability to respond effectively, even to a situation like the pandemic. And that therefore it justifies, I think, exactly the sort of call that is being made through the CE bill for an emergency response. It asks us to engage in what I like to think of as lifeboat economics. We are not being gathered safely into a safe haven by a pilot boat that's leading us comfortably along the direction that we've always been led before. And we are instead in a situation where we're being tipped out of the liner into the rough and roiling seas, unable actually to apply many of the rules that had led us to this point. The dialogue around win-win is no longer a sufficient one to deal with the emergency of climate change. It is inevitable because of the speed at which we need to change, as laid out by the science and as laid out very clearly by Kevin and EJ, that we need to take urgent action. That urgent action has consequences. It will be disruptive. It will have distributional consequences, but it is absolutely essential to protect well-being for everybody, both in the short term, as we've seen through the incidents, the climate emergency incidents this summer and over this year, and in the longer term, as the scientific evidence makes clear. And I think our starting place to some extent is to ask what exactly prosperity is. And in that question, we've been given an object lesson through the pandemic that prosperity is as much about health as it is about wealth, and perhaps more so. A very strange thing happened in the height of the pandemic, and it was that almost every government around the world recognized suddenly that actually prosperity is as much about health as it is about wealth. And we stopped the economy almost in its tracks. At some points, we reduced certain activities absolutely drastically overnight. We found the capacity within government to make interventions that had been ideologically ruled out up to that point, including the repurposing of supply chains, the building of hospitals, the direct provision of livelihoods to people, and indeed the monetary power of government to engage in those activities, which had been ruled out by the Maastricht Treaty, was overturned almost overnight. And the government was able to spend through the Ways and Means Committee at the central bank, a sort of overdraft facility, if you like, in order to achieve what it was necessary to achieve to save people's lives, to protect well-being through the pandemic. I would argue, and I think the science that Kevin and EJ have presented confirms this, that the crises that we're facing into the future from the climate and from the loss of biodiversity are more dangerous, more immediate, and more damaging than the pandemic that we have just been through. And the logic of that situation is therefore that we need this lifeboat economics right now. We need this lifeboat economics to take those emergency measures. We need it to look after people's livelihoods, to protect nature, to engage in a reorganization of supply chains, to allow businesses to make the decisions that they need to put themselves on a 1.5 emissions pathway, and indeed, when and where necessary, for governments to invest in the infrastructure of a zero carbon economy that is consistent with a nature positive world. And what the pandemic has shown us is that all of these things are possible. All of them can be achieved actually overnight. All of them rely on political will, but that political will was found through the pandemic, and it can be found through the climate crisis. It is an ask of COP, really, to create and to build that political will, not just across the world, but actually within the UK, and to create within the UK the architecture of an economic system that puts prosperity as health as its guiding principle at the heart of the economy. In a livable world, we're very reliant on this reality of being able to take carbon out of the atmosphere towards the end of the century. Now we're in a situation where we're recognizing that we need to be taking the carbon out of the atmosphere now. And that requires us actually to be thinking very differently about how we invest, what we invest in, and to some extent what investment actually means in a world in which we no longer emit carbon but have to absorb carbon. And these investments have to have a very different characteristic from the investment markets of the past. And we've been tempted, almost persuaded by economists and by a kind of consumerist culture, if you like, that investment is a way of getting rich quick, that it's a way of making a fast buck, never mind the cost to other people, and that the best people win in that race, in that sort of gambling casino by luck or by the devil, and can in that way support themselves and become rich very quick. And I think, to me, that is a travesty of the concept of investment, because investment comes from a very fundamental aspect of human nature, which is about prudence, is about looking to the future, looking to care for the future, care for other people into the future. And that means taking actions now which represent a commitment to that future. And if we reframe investment as a commitment to that future, then our portfolio of investment is totally different. It's a regenerative portfolio. It's investing in land, it's investing in trees, it's investing in people. And of course, it's also investing in some nice technology, some nice kit as well, the renewable energy technologies that will help us to move to a no carbon world. But it is a very, very different scale and pace of investments. And I would not be sitting in a university in which I have to go to the people who hold my pension and insist that they move a small part of it out of the fossil fuel investments that I don't want to be investing my pension in after 35 years of working against the fossil fuel society. And I think ordinary people, when you ask them, they don't want that kind of pension either. They want pension investments that are secure, that are long-term. They may not be massive returns on those pensions, but they are savings vehicles that are doing good with their money in the market. And as I see it, and as I read the mood music around people's sense of that, getting that investment infrastructure right could very well start with the simple idea of making pensions fossil free. In response to the climate emergency, in response to the emergency in relation to biodiversity that Kevin and EJ have set out so eloquently in the previous presentations, we need desperately to move to a different kind of economics, a different kind of economy. And the basis for that is already within our sights and within the ability of politicians to enact. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Tim. And that brings to an end the three outstanding presentations. And we move straight on to a Q&A. This is actually from our 0 Hour team. Why are the 3 COP outcomes important? Who'd like to take that first?
My expertise and focus is on energy and climate change. But perhaps that's the problem, is that what we have done and what we've been phenomenally successful at doing for 200 years is reductionist thinking. And that has given us a lot of the well-being that we see in our society, but it's also meant that we haven't addressed the systemic challenges. And I'm not even sure yet we've got the tools to be able to know how to address the systemic challenges. And the important thing about those 3 objectives is it does actually look at it from a system perspective. Climate change is but one symptom of a much deeper set of concerns that we have. at the moment, I still think we are struggling. We use the language, and we're getting more eloquent at using the language of systems thinking. But actually what that means in practice, I think we are still struggling with. And I work in a university, as do quite a few of us here. And all our universities are premised on departments and disciplines are premised on that wonderful, effective reductionist way of looking at the world. And whilst that has been positive in the past, I think it has also brought with it the systemic challenges that we're now facing. And sadly, it's left us ill-equipped at the moment to know how to really address those things. So these three objectives are an attempt, politically at least, to start to bring this together, to make us think about not just the climate, not just the ecology, but the broader set of issues at a systemic level.
Very good. And I've got EJ.
I really like the framing of the triple challenge that brings in not just climate and nature, but also human well-being and sustainable development goals. So I do completely agree with what Kevin's saying about this kind of joined up thinking, but joining up with that third kind of pillar of the stool, if you like, is the way to stop toppling over. So I think one thing that I might add is that, this well-being framing that Tim put at the heart of what he was saying is so important, because it's people who are at the heart of this and should stay that way.
This is from Kate Jeffrey. Many people I talk to feel that the situation is hopeless. I think this hopelessness is something we should avoid. Just let me interrupt there. But we're not capable of mustering the collective action needed to prevent catastrophic warming. After all, we can't even get people to protect themselves against a virus. How do we overcome fatalism, cynicism, and despair? Now, I have a feeling that's a question we might want to leave on the table because it's an extremely broad question. Has anyone got a very short answer to that?
It seems to me that the antidote to despair is not some form of fairy tale optimism, but action. The antidote to despair is action. And the places where we can find action, whatever that action is, are the places that lead us out of despair and towards progress. And it's what I tell my students. It's what I tell myself when I get up in the morning as well. And I think it has, at least some resonance. It's very, very tempting to give in to those places of despair. But actually having a sense of a route map, having a different sense of progress, as Kevin was talking about, having an action that you can engage in as a citizen in the world is the place that lifts you out of that fatalism and away from the cynicism.
Very good. And now I've got one from Anna Hyde. Do we already have a baseline for nature for 2020? How should we measure impact going forward?
Our biodiversity knowledge is not that great. So we have baselines in some senses. So we have the Living Planet Index that I showed you. We have some kind of estimates of the extent to which land has been converted and into what. We have some understanding of extinction risk through the red lists. But what we don't have is the kind of really granular baselines for nature, even in this country, actually. So, unless we have a baseline, we can't think about progress. But then I wouldn't say that what we have to do is spend 5 years doing all the research to get a baseline, because that's a waste of time. I think what we need to do is to start to think about how do we recover nature, having a broad brush understanding of what is needed, which we already have. And so we do have a baseline that is probably good enough to enable us to be able to say, here's where we need to get to, and let's start to move in the right direction as we improve our understanding of that baseline.
Thank you very much. I've got one more question that I want to deliver, and then I think we must wrap up. This is from Alex Bradbury. Why is it so important to address the climate and nature emergencies together at COP and at home? Query. And if it is so important, why isn't this happening already?
Just look at the scenarios in the IPCC Working Group 3, or indeed look at the spreadsheet, which very few academics ever do, underpinning the Committee on Climate Change's balanced net zero pathway. What you'll see is a huge amount of negative emissions technologies, ways that we're going to find to suck CO2 out of the air. And virtually all of those, 95% of them, are based on a particular technology called BECCS, biomass energy with carbon capture and storage. And that's why we have to think about bringing broader ecological issues with climate change together, because the ecological impacts of the levels of biomass growth, monocropped biomass growth and harvesting and transport that would be necessary to deliver anything approaching the amount of negative emissions that are reliant on this technology in the models would be devastating ecologically. You're talking about possibly up to the size of 3 times size of India being planted to give you something around about the median level of negative emission technologies assumed in the IPCC scenarios. So the problem is, again, I come back to the point before, our reductionist way of thinking means that experts on carbon don't think about the broader ecological impacts. And probably quite often, experts on other broader ecological impacts don't necessarily think about the impacts on carbon. Planting trees, afforestation can mobilize the carbon in the soil that can completely outweigh the carbon absorbed in the trees. So maybe reforestation or forestry management rather than afforestation. So there are a whole lot of complicated issues here that mean we have to think of these things together.
And over to you, EJ.
I can't better that answer, apart from to say that if we do refrain from causing impact, ecological impact, then that is one of the best ways to make sure that things don't get worse. But yeah, completely agreed. In terms of why they've been siloed, well, that's why everything's been siloed. You know, environment has always been the kind of poor relation of trade, the Treasury, those other major kind of financial ministries, because that's the way we think about growth, and that's the way we think about prosperity. So we need to change the way we think about prosperity. And I think also the UN system doesn't help, because you have these conventions that are very separate. So the Biological Diversity Convention has never really been kind of linked up with the Framework Convention on Climate Change, and it's incredibly hard to get these cross-convention things going. I mean, working groups don't really cut it. You need actual proper cross-convention linkages that carry some teeth, so that governments are signing up to something a little bit more integrated. That's why I thought the Leaders' Pledge for Nature was so good, because it was the first time I'd seen leaders signing up to something that actually feels a little bit integrated.
Thank you, EJ. And over to Tim. Have you got a comment there?
The narrow sense of that progress as continually being about the expansion of economic activity. And that has made us fearful of the idea of limits. It's made us avoid the idea of limits. And I think that's a mistake. There's a conservationist in the US called Wendell Berry, and he has a lovely quote, which is sort of on my wall most of the time. Human and earthly limits, properly understood, are not confinements, but rather inducements to fullness of relationship and meaning. And what he's saying there, that the opportunity that both the climate crisis and the biodiversity, the nature crisis present us with, is rethinking our sense of what it means to be human beings on a finite planet, rethinking our sense of what it means to be well on that planet, and actually perhaps finding some quite surprising answers that beyond the consumer society and the materialism of endless growth lies a richness that we can only as yet glimpse, a place where our lives are healthier, where our relationships are stronger, where our environment is intact, and indeed where our sense of hope for the future is something on which we can rely. And to me, that's the opportunity that lies behind the CEE bill. And an important part of reaching that opportunity is to acknowledge the place that we are at the moment. It is precisely the emergencies that Kevin and EJ and yourself, David, have pointed out so eloquently.
We are working on something we're calling marine biomass regeneration. And looking at the oceans, 72% of the world's surface is often forgotten about. The ocean whale population is less than 1% of what it was by estimates from 300 years ago. And the fish population is also way down on what it's been in the past. The question is there a means of regenerating that biomass in our oceans? Because I think this would serve a double purpose of regeneration of the living matter on the planet, but at the same time removing carbon dioxide. And that's a key question. I'm not suggesting I know the answer, but we need to be thinking of these two topics together, biodiversity and climate change, because there's so much interaction between the two.
So hi, Tim, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us again.
Yeah, you're welcome. I was pleased I could be there yesterday. It was a good discussion.
Fantastic. Yeah, we just wanted to invite you back just to ask one final question that we didn't get time to cover in the event that we felt was quite crucial.
Yep, happy to do that.
Great, I will fire away. So the question is, what are the positive economic and social benefits of meeting the Paris Agreement target of 1.5 degrees and regenerating nature through the 2030 global goal for nature? And this question is both in terms of cost saved and jobs and wealth created.
Yeah, I mean, I think the evidence has been very strong for a long time, really since the Stern Review in 2006, that you save the costs by doing the action now. The costs of climate change down the road look really, quite momentous and enough to sink an economy at the end of the day, and possibly even worse. We're talking about undermining the life system, support system in which we live, and that has consequences you can't even measure in economic cost. And the same is true, of course, for the damage that we're doing to nature. It's much more difficult to assess, but what we do know is that when you undermine biodiversity, that's the basis of our food chain, and there's no economic value actually that you can put on that benefit to society from nature. So it's always been clear that taking action now is the way to avoid those costs. But it's also very worth saying that there are real benefits in the development of new technologies. There are jobs in those new sectors. And you could argue, for example, one of the things that we have to do is make sure the standards of insulation in our homes are as high as they possibly can be. And that means jobs in every constituency, because there are homes in every constituency that fall below those standards. So these are real economic and social benefits. And I would argue there's also some further out benefits. I was talking yesterday about the transition to a zero carbon economy in terms of a shift towards our services, our health service, for example, and the implications there are actually in supporting that transition, that we would get not just less carbon, we'd also get more jobs and potentially more quality jobs as well. And in the long run, I think we have to ask ourselves, are there even some deeper benefits of going beyond our consumer society and the materialistic values that seem to serve us in the short term, but actually in some ways prevent us from finding our full potential and leading to a flourishing society in which we can bring back hope for the future. So these are immeasurable benefits from taking the actions that are implied by the CEE bill.
Thank you so much, Tim. Yeah, I think a really important message of hope there going forward. So thank you so much for joining us again today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Amy.
So the 0 Hour campaign is calling on the government to push for the following 3 COP outcomes we can't live without at the Climate Summit COP26 in Glasgow in November 21 and the Biodiversity Summit COP15 in Kunming, China in spring next year. So these 3 COP outcomes that we're calling for are: 1, to create a joint emergency strategy for climate and nature; 2, to commit to the carbon budget for 1.5; and 3, to go nature positive by 2030. So yeah, huge thank you to you all for everyone's question, and of course a special thank you to Sir David King, Professor Kevin Anderson, Professor E.J. Milner-Gulland and Professor Tim Jackson. Thank you so much.